A decorated cop, a deadly betrayal, a fight for justice. Keanu Reeves was framed for a crime he didn't commit. But when his loyal K9 Max uncovers a shocking secret in court, the real hunt begins. How deep does the corruption go? Who is truly pulling the strings? Don't miss this gripping story of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. Hit like and subscribe to follow Ethan and Max as they uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Betrayal in the courtroom. The heavy air inside the packed courtroom felt suffocating. Every eye in the room was on Keanu Reeves, the once revered detective, now reduced to a man in shackles. The judge's gavel slammed against the wood, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber. Guilty. The words sliced through Ethan like a knife. He felt the blood drain from his face. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and spectators whispered in shock. How could this happen? How could Detective Keanu Reeves, a man with 15 years of spotless service, be found guilty of a crime he didn't commit? Ethan clenched his fists, his wrists bound by cold steel cuffs. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't flinch. He had expected this. He knew the system had turned against him, twisted by unseen hands manipulating justice like a marionette. At the back of the courtroom, a familiar figure sat. Max, his loyal K9 partner, a muscular German shepherd with intelligent, piercing eyes. Max sat still, ears pricked, gaze locked onto Ethan. The dog sensed the tension in the room. He had been by Ethan's side for years, through gunfights, stings, and stakeouts. And now in Ethan's darkest moment, Max remained unwavering. But nothing could change the fact that Ethan was being sent away. The judge continued reading the verdict, but Ethan barely registered the words. His mind was spinning. He knew the evidence had been planted. He knew it. But the jury had been convinced. The fingerprints, the weapon, the falsified reports, it was all orchestrated too perfectly. And he knew exactly who had done it. At the prosecution's table, Captain Richard Hale sat with a composed, almost smug look. The man Ethan once admired, the man who had mentored him, had orchestrated his downfall. Ethan could still hear Hale's voice echoing from their last conversation. "You ask too many questions, Walker. Sometimes it's best to let things be." Ethan had refused to let things be, and now he was paying the price. The judge's voice finally cut through the haze in his mind. "Detective Walker, you are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Officers, take him into custody." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting, the public gasping. Ethan remained still, gripping the table in front of him, forcing himself to stay calm. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Two officers stepped forward, ready to escort him away. But before they could move him, Ethan's voice rang out, raw and desperate. "Your Honor." The room fell silent again. The judge hesitated, studying Ethan's expression. "Before I go, I have one last request." His voice cracked. "Please, let me say goodbye to Max." A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge's eyes narrowed, but there was something in Ethan's voice. Something real, something human. Finally, the judge nodded. 3 minutes. The moment Max was released from his handler, the dog sprinted to Ethan, his claws clicking loudly against the marble floor. Ethan dropped to his knees, embracing his partner. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I let you down." Max whined, pressing his face against Ethan's chest. But then suddenly his body tensed. Ethan felt it. Max's breathing changed, his nose twitching furiously against Ethan's jacket. The dog began pulling at the fabric, barking sharply. "Max!" Ethan frowned. The sudden, sharp bark shattered the stillness of the courtroom. The judge sat up straighter. "What's going on?" he demanded. Max barked again, louder, more urgent, his alert stance unmistakable. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously. "Something's off," he muttered, reaching for Ethan's jacket. Then, a metallic clink. Something small hit the floor. A hush fell over the room. Every eye locked onto the tiny device now lying beneath the courtroom lights. A recording device. The prosecutor's face turned pale. "That's nothing," he started, but his voice wavered. Max barked again, his deep growl vibrating through the courtroom. The officer who had picked up the recorder glanced at the judge. The judge hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Play it." A burst of static filled the room. Then, voices, muffled at first, then terrifyingly clear. "Plant the evidence. No one will question it. Walker's spotless record makes him the perfect fall guy. Just get it done." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He knew that voice. Captain Richard Hale. His own boss had framed him. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The prosecutor, Hale's right-hand man, looked like he was about to collapse. "This proves nothing," the prosecutor stammered. "That recording could be—" Bang! The judge's gavel came down with enough force to shake the room. "That's enough." His voice was steel. "Officers, take custody of that device and bring Captain Hale to my chambers, now." Hale's composure finally cracked. He opened his mouth, but before he could utter a word, two officers seized him by the arms. His face drained of color. Ethan barely breathed. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in his chest. As the officers escorted him back to holding, Ethan turned for one last look at Max. The dog's intelligent eyes met his, and in that moment, Ethan silently vowed, "I'm going to bring them all down, unraveling the conspiracy." The holding cell was cold, its cement walls bare and unfeeling. Keanu Reeves sat on the hard bench, staring at the blank surface ahead, his mind racing. Max had uncovered the truth, a truth that could clear his name. But Ethan knew this was far from over. The recording proved Captain Richard Hale had set him up, but it also hinted at something bigger, something more sinister, because Hale hadn't acted alone. The storm begins. Back in the courthouse, Judge Holloway sat in his chambers, replaying the damning recording over and over. His face was grim, his fingers tapping against the desk in thought. He had seen corruption before, but this was something else entirely. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Summon Captain Hale, immediately." Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Hale was still reeling from what had just happened. The moment the officers approached him, he knew the game was up. He straightened his tie, trying to keep his mask of control in place, but his hands were sweating. They knew. The moment he stepped into the judge's chambers, he felt it, the weight of the law closing in on him. The recording device sat on the judge's desk like a loaded gun, ready to fire. Judge Holloway leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Hale. "Explain this." Hale hesitated for only a second before scoffing. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. That could be anyone's voice." The judge pressed play again. "Just plant the evidence. No one will question it. Walker's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat." Hale's face drained of color, but he forced a chuckle. This is absurd. You can't seriously believe—" The judge's voice hardened. "I don't believe. I act on evidence. And this is evidence of a crime." He gestured toward the two officers standing at the door. "Take him into custody, now." The moment the officers moved, Hale's composure shattered. He shoved one of them away and lunged toward the desk, reaching for the recorder. But Max's growl rumbled from the hallway, and before Hale could react, the officers tackled him to the ground. As they hauled him away, panic flickered in his eyes. Ethan wasn't the only one in trouble now. The investigation widens. Ethan sat in his cell, unaware of the firestorm brewing outside. He knew Hale was guilty, but the real question was, who else was involved? Elsewhere, his former colleague Sarah Miller was still in shock. She had worked with Ethan for years. If they could frame him so easily, what did that mean for the rest of the department? She had taken temporary custody of Max, knowing the dog would struggle being apart from Ethan. But Max was restless, pacing in his kennel, barking in sharp, anxious bursts. He knew something wasn't right. Following her gut, Sarah decided to take Max back to Ethan's locker at the precinct. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until Max started pawing at the lower compartment, sniffing furiously. Sarah's stomach twisted. What now? She crouched down, unlocking the compartment. Inside, beneath Ethan's old uniforms, was a sealed manila envelope. She hesitated before opening it, and then her breath caught in her throat. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear. They showed Captain Hale meeting with a well-known crime boss, But that wasn't all. Tucked behind the photos was a series of financial records, wire transfers, signed documents, tying Hale to a network of dirty cops and criminals. It was bigger than she ever imagined. Her pulse pounded. She had to get this to the judge, fast. But as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated before answering. "Walk away, Miller." The voice was deep, unrecognizable, but filled with quiet menace. "Before you dig yourself a grave." The call disconnected. Sarah's blood ran cold. She had just made herself a target. Ethan walks free, but the fight is far from over. Less than 24 hours later, Ethan was pulled from his cell. He wasn't told why, just escorted out of holding under heavy guard. He was led to a secure conference room. Sitting inside was Judge Holloway, and next to him, Sarah, a thick folder of evidence in front of her. And sitting beside Sarah, his tail wagging but his eyes watchful, was Max. The moment Ethan saw his partner, something inside him loosened. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The judge pushed the file toward him. "This proves your innocence. More than that, it proves Captain Hale and several others have been running a criminal operation within the department." Ethan stared at the documents. His entire life had been ruined by these people. And now he had a chance to fight back. His voice cracked as he asked, "Does this mean I'm free?" The judge nodded. "It does." A breath of relief left Ethan's lips. He knelt beside Max, running his hands through the dog's fur. "You saved me, boy. You saved me again." But before the relief could settle, Sarah spoke. "Ethan, we need your help." He looked up. "With what?" She hesitated. "Exposing the rest of them." Ethan exhaled sharply. His mind told him to walk away, to take his freedom and leave this nightmare behind. But then he looked at Max, and he knew. He couldn't walk away from this. Not yet. "I'm in." Sarah nodded, but her expression was grim. "Good, because if we do this, we'll be painting targets on our backs." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better make it count." Max let out a sharp bark, as if in agreement. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was just getting started. The deadly truth. The hunters become the hunted. Keanu Reeves stood in the dimly lit safe house, flipping through the stack of evidence Sarah had uncovered. The weight of it was crushing. Captain Hale had been just the beginning. There were dozens of names, including high-ranking officers, politicians, and even federal agents. The corruption ran deep. They weren't just looking at dirty cops anymore. They were staring at a criminal empire hiding within the justice system itself. Max sat beside him, ears pricked, his sharp eyes darting between Ethan and Sarah. Even the dog could sense the storm brewing. Sarah exhaled, rubbing a hand through her hair. "If we go public with this now, they'll cover it up before it even makes the news. We need something ironclad, something that can't be buried." Ethan nodded. "We need to go after the head of the snake, a RAR, the mysterious figure whose initials kept appearing in every dirty transaction. The real mastermind behind everything." And just as they began connecting the dots, a text flashed on Ethan's phone. "You're digging too deep. Stop or you'll regret it." Ethan stared at the screen. His gut told him what was coming next. They weren't just being threatened, they were being hunted. The nightmare begins that night. The safe house was eerily silent. Too silent. Ethan and Sarah worked through documents, cross-referencing names, their nerves stretched tight. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Then, Max's head snapped up. His ears flicked. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Ethan immediately stiffened. "What is it, boy?" Max stood and trotted to the door, his nose pressed against the crack beneath it, sniffing furiously. Then, the lights flickered. Sarah's breath hitched. "That's not normal." A split second later, glass shattered. "Down!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Sarah and yanking her behind the couch. The front window exploded inward, shards flying as silhouetted figures rushed through the doorway, weapons raised. They had found them. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the walls. Sarah crawled toward the files, shoving them into a duffel bag. Ethan returned fire, ducking behind overturned furniture. "We have to move now!" Max barked wildly, lunging at one of the intruders. his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's arm. The attacker screamed, dropping his weapon as he desperately tried to shake the dog off. Then, another gunshot. Ethan spun just in time to see a bullet tear through Max's side. No! The sound of Max yelping sent a cold dagger through Ethan's chest. But despite the wound, Max refused to go down, still growling, still protecting his partner. Ethan's vision turned red. He shot the attacker, grabbed Max, and hauled him up as Sarah kicked open the back door. They ran. Through the trees, through the dark, bullets whizzing past them. Ethan's arms burned as he carried Max, his blood staining Ethan's jacket. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of time. A shocking revelation. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into an abandoned warehouse near the city's edge. Ethan carefully laid Max down, pressing a hand to the bleeding wound. "Stay with me, buddy." His voice cracked. "I need you." Sarah ripped open the duffel bag, shuffling through the files. Her face was pale. "Ethan." He looked up. She held up a photograph. It was a picture of him, taken just weeks before his arrest. He was outside a coffee shop, unaware of the camera capturing him. Below it, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "Walker is expendable." Ethan's stomach twisted. They planned this before the case even happened. Sarah nodded. They were never just framing you for one crime. They were eliminating you because you got too close. That's when Ethan realized the horrifying truth. The trial, the evidence, the entire case against him. It wasn't just a frame job. It was an execution order. The enemy revealed. Before they could process what this meant, the warehouse door slammed open. A group of armed men stepped inside, and at the center of them was a figure Ethan recognized instantly. Chief Thomas Archer, a man who had spent years building a reputation as a law-abiding officer. A man who had publicly condemned corruption. A man who had called Ethan a disgrace after his conviction. He was A.R. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Chief Archer smiled. "Walker, I told them you were smart, but I have to admit, I didn't think you'd get this far." Ethan's jaw clenched. "It was you. You set me up." Archer gave an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, come on, Ethan. You act like this is personal." He chuckled. "It's just business." Ethan's fist tightened. "Business? You destroyed my life. You nearly got Max killed. And you call it business?" Archer shrugged. "Don't be dramatic. Your life was never yours to begin with. You were just another pawn in the system." Sarah's hand inched toward her gun. Archer's men immediately raised their weapons. Ah, Archer tutted. "Let's not make this messy. You both know how this ends." Ethan glanced at Max, who was still weak but watching Archer with unwavering loyalty. They were cornered, no way out. Then, Max moved. Despite his wound, he lunged at Archer's leg, biting down with every ounce of strength he had left. The distraction was all Ethan needed. In a flash, Ethan grabbed a metal pipe and swung, hard, slamming it into the nearest gunman. Sarah dropped low, firing at another, sending him sprawling to the ground. Chaos erupted. Max refused to let go of Archer, even as the man stumbled, shouting in pain. Ethan took advantage of the confusion, grabbing Archer's gun and pressing it against his skull. "Call them off, now!" Archer sneered. "Or what? You kill me? That won't stop this." Ethan's finger hovered over the trigger. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, sirens. Floodlights flooded the warehouse. A SWAT team stormed inside. Ethan and Sarah didn't have to fight anymore. Backup had arrived. The game was over. The fall, Chief Archer and his men were arrested on the spot. The files were handed over to federal prosecutors. Within 48 hours, the scandal exploded across the nation. Multiple officers, politicians, and officials were arrested. Keanu Reeves' name was cleared. Max was rushed into surgery and survived. But is it really over? Weeks later, Ethan stood on his porch, watching Max play in the yard. Sarah approached, handing him a sealed letter. "The department wants you back." Ethan looked at her, then at Max. He sighed. "I think I've had enough of the badge." Sarah nodded. "So what now?" Ethan smirked. "We bring down the next one. Because corruption never truly ends. And he wasn't done fighting. Justice or vengeance? The aftermath. The dust had settled, but the war was far from over. The case against Chief Thomas Archer had rattled the nation. The trial was high profile, exposing an entire web of corruption that stretched beyond just the police force. Politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking officials were now under investigation. Keanu Reeves should have felt relieved, but he wasn't. Standing outside the courthouse, he watched as the media swarmed to cover the scandal. News anchors shouted questions, cameras flashed, and people argued about the fallout. Beside him, Max stood tall, his body still healing, but his spirit as unbreakable as ever. Sarah appeared next to Ethan, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "You look like you just got sentenced instead of exonerated." Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Because I know this isn't over." She nodded grimly. "The FBI is running a full-scale investigation, but you and I both know some of these guys will slip through the cracks." That's what kept Ethan up at night. Justice wasn't always clean. It wasn't always swift. Some of the names on that list, they were still out there, watching, waiting. A deal with the devil. 3 weeks later, Ethan received an unexpected invitation, a private meeting, with someone he never thought he'd sit across from again. Captain Richard Hale, the man who had betrayed him, now sat in an orange jumpsuit across the table in a secured federal facility. Hale smirked. "Guess you won, Walker." Ethan leaned forward. "What do you want?" Hale's smirk faded. His eyes darkened. "I want to talk about AR." Ethan tensed. "Chief Archer is in prison." Hale shook his head. "No, Walker. Archer was just a middleman. You think this ends with him? You have no idea how deep this goes." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Then start talking." Hale sighed, his demeanor shifting from cocky to serious. "There are people out there right now, dangerous people, who see what you did and don't like it. They don't care about Archer. But you're a problem." Ethan clenched his fists. "Let them come." Hale chuckled. "You don't get it. They already are. And they won't just come for you." His eyes flicked toward the two-way mirror. "They'll come for anyone close to you." Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. Sarah, Maximum, his friends. They were all targets now. Hale leaned in. "I have names. I have locations. But I'm not just giving them to you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" Hale grinned. "I want out." Silence stretched between them. The man who framed him now wanted a deal? Sarah's voice echoed in Ethan's head from weeks ago. "If we push this any further, we're going to make enemies. Dangerous ones." She was right. This wasn't over, and Ethan had a choice. Take the deal and get the information, or let Hale rot and risk walking blind into the next storm. Max, lying by Ethan's feet, let out a soft growl, sensing his master's turmoil. Ethan exhaled. "Fine, start talking." A new hunt begins. Days later, Ethan stood on the rooftop of a city high-rise, staring down at the streets below. Sarah joined him. "So, what did Hale give you?" Ethan handed her a file. Names, places, another network, another fight. She flipped through it, then sighed. "We could walk away, you know. You're free now. Max is alive. We could leave all this behind." Ethan looked at her. "And let the next innocent cop take the fall? Let them ruin more lives?" Sarah held his gaze. Then she smirked. "Didn't think so." Max barked once, as if giving his approval. Ethan ruffled the dog's fur. "Come on, boy. Looks like we've got work to do." Because justice wasn't just a courtroom battle, it was a war, and Keanu Reeves wasn't done fighting.